You need to understand something that most people misunderstand completely when it comes to avoidant behavior. When someone with avoidant tendencies pulls away, the immediate reaction is usually to think they've lost interest, stopped caring, or emotionally checked out. But in many cases, that assumption is not only incorrect, it misses what's actually going on underneath. Because when an avoidant truly stops caring, their behavior is very different. They don't create distance while still keeping a thread of contact. They don't step back and still leave small signals behind. They don't disappear and then reappear with quiet check-ins or indirect ways of staying in touch. When they're really done, it's usually clear, complete, and emotionally closed off. But that's not what happens when feelings are still there. What you often see instead is inconsistency. They withdraw, but not fully. They go quiet, but not entirely. They create space, yet they don't fully exit. That contradiction is not manipulation or mixed signals on purpose. It's internal conflict. It's someone experiencing emotions they feel deeply, but don't feel stable inside of. Avoidant individuals are not necessarily avoiding the person in front of them. More often, they are trying to manage what the emotional closeness is doing to them internally. When feelings become too strong or too consuming, it can trigger discomfort, overwhelm, or a loss of control. So their instinct is to step back, not because they don't care, but because caring starts to feel like too much at once. But here's what gets missed in that process. Even when they pull away, they rarely disconnect completely. They leave small openings. A message sent after silence, a reaction to something you posted, a brief check-in that seems minor but carries meaning. These aren't random actions. They are controlled forms of staying connected without fully exposing themselves emotionally. It's almost like they're communicating, "I need space, but I'm not gone." That in-between state, where they are neither fully present nor fully absent, is often where their real emotional truth shows itself. This doesn't make the experience easy. It can feel confusing and even painful for the other person. But when you look at it from a psychological perspective instead of reacting emotionally, it starts to make more sense. This isn't about someone who doesn't feel. It's about someone who struggles to stay regulated inside what they feel. So the pattern becomes push and pull, connection, then distance, then connection again. A common mistake is to respond to their distance with more intensity, thinking closeness will fix the gap. But in reality, that intensity is often what triggered the withdrawal in the first place. What reveals their true level of attachment is not how they behave when things are easy, but what they do when they step away. Do they cut it off completely, or do they still leave subtle traces of connection? Because those traces, however small they seem, are not indifference. They are attachment trying to exist under pressure. Once you see it this way, the meaning of distance changes. It stops feeling like pure rejection and starts looking more like a coping strategy, even if it's not a healthy one. And there is another layer that people often overlook. When an avoidant is emotionally attached, even if they pull back in interaction, they often stay mentally engaged, not in an obvious or direct way, but in a quiet, observant way. They notice changes. They pick up on patterns. They are aware of your presence, your absence, your shifts in tone or energy, even when they are not actively communicating. This creates a strange contrast. On the surface, they seem distant. Internally, they are still tracking and processing. The reason is simple. Observation feels safer than emotional participation. Direct engagement requires vulnerability and exposure, and that can feel overwhelming. But observing allows them to stay connected without risking rejection or losing control of their emotional state. So instead of expressing what they feel, they often analyze it. Instead of asking directly, they try to interpret. Instead of showing vulnerability, they collect information quietly in the background. This is why silence can be misunderstood. People assume silence means absence. But for someone like this, silence is often active. It's not empty. It's full of thought, processing, and emotional sorting. You may even notice small signs of it. They might view what you post, but not respond. They may remember details you never expected them to keep. They might bring up something you said long ago, even while appearing distant at the time. None of this is random. It's what happens when someone is still emotionally engaged, but trying to manage it from a distance. These are signs of attention without expression. and attention is still a form of investment. Here's a deeper psychological truth that most people overlook. The mind doesn't repeatedly focus on something that carries no meaning. We don't continuously notice, track, or mentally register things that are emotionally irrelevant to us. So when someone keeps showing awareness of your presence from a distance, even without direct communication, it usually indicates that something in them is still active. Not necessarily resolved, not necessarily stable, but still engaged. At the same time, this doesn't mean the connection is complete or healthy. Observing someone is not the same as being in a relationship with them. Attention from a distance cannot replace communication, emotional clarity, or real presence. It only points to internal engagement, not relational stability. This is where perspective matters. The goal is not to overread every small sign or become emotionally reactive to it, because once you start shaping your behavior around being noticed, you lose your center. You begin adjusting yourself for signals instead of staying grounded in your own direction. The healthier way to understand it is simple. Their distance is not always absence, and their silence is not always disinterest. Sometimes, even without words, there is still a quiet form of awareness happening in the background. But that awareness alone is not something you build your life around. You don't confuse passive attention with active commitment. Your role is not to chase it, perform for it, or try to increase it. Your role is to stay clear, to understand what their behavior suggests without letting it control your emotional state. Clarity changes everything about how you respond. Instead of reacting, you observe. Instead of forcing meaning, you let patterns reveal themselves over time. And when you look at it from that place, you stop asking only, do they care? And start noticing where their attention consistently goes. Because attention does reveal interest, but interest alone is not the same as emotional availability or readiness. Once you understand that someone can remain psychologically present even while being emotionally distant, the next layer becomes clearer. People with avoidant patterns often don't express their feelings directly. Instead, they test. To the outside eye, this can look like mixed signals, inconsistency, or emotional confusion. But at a deeper level, it's often an indirect way of answering an internal question they don't know how to say out loud. Is it safe for me to open up here? For someone with avoidant tendencies, vulnerability doesn't feel neutral. It feels exposing. It carries associations of loss of control, emotional risk, and past experiences where closeness may not have felt safe or steady. So instead of expressing emotions directly, they create small behavioral experiments to measure emotional safety without revealing too much of themselves. They might step back slightly to see how you respond. They might slow their communication to observe your consistency. They might act less emotionally available to see whether you become anxious, reactive, or overly pursuing. From the outside, this can be misread as games or manipulation, but psychologically, it's often a form of self-regulation. They are trying to determine whether closeness feels stable or overwhelming. This is also where most people unintentionally struggle. When they sense distance, they often respond with more effort, more urgency, or more emotional intensity. They try to close the gap quickly, but from the avoidant perspective, that level of intensity can feel like pressure. And pressure reinforces the very fear that caused them to step back in the first place. So the cycle continues. They withdraw, the other person pursues, and the emotional distance grows. What tends to shift the dynamic is not escalation, but steadiness. When someone remains grounded, consistent, and emotionally balanced without chasing or collapsing, the interaction feels different. It becomes less overwhelming, less threatening, more predictable. And predictability is what creates a sense of safety for someone who struggles with emotional exposure. In that sense, testing is not really about control over you. It's more about trying to regulate their own emotional experience. It's a cautious way of approaching closeness without fully committing to vulnerability all at once. A simple way to understand it is this: people who are indifferent don't test. They don't monitor reactions, consistency, or emotional responses. There's no need to. Indifference doesn't seek reassurance. Interest does. Still, awareness of this pattern does not mean you should tolerate confusion or overextend yourself trying to decode it. Understanding behavior is not the same as accepting unhealthy dynamics. You are not responsible for passing someone's emotional uncertainty or proving your worth through patience alone. What awareness does give you is clarity. And with clarity, your response changes. You stop chasing meaning in every inconsistency. You stop reacting impulsively to distance. You stop overperforming to maintain attention. Instead, you remain steady in yourself, observing behavior without losing your center to it. And this is where everything either moves forward or quietly falls back into the same pattern. Because those small moments of openness are not just emotional events, they are turning points in real time. In that brief space, when someone lets their guard down, even slightly, the direction of the connection is being shaped by how you respond to it. Most people underestimate this part. They either react too strongly or they treat it too lightly. Both extremes send a message, and neither message creates safety. When you overreact, even with good intentions, it can feel like pressure to the other person. It turns something soft into something heavy. It makes the moment feel larger than what they were emotionally prepared to hold. And for someone who already struggles with vulnerability, that weight can become enough to shut them down again. On the other hand, when you dismiss it or respond without presence, it can feel like it didn't land, like what they shared wasn't received. And that creates a different kind of withdrawal. Not because they didn't want to open up, but because it felt unnoticed or emotionally unsupported. So what actually helps in those moments is something far more subtle. It's not intensity. It's not distance either. It's grounded presence. The ability to stay emotionally available without escalating the moment beyond what it is. When they share something personal, or when you catch that shift in tone, or when their usual distance briefly softens, the most powerful response is often the simplest one. You stay steady. You don't rush to analyze it, label it, or expand it into something it's not yet ready to become. You let it exist without pressure. That kind of response communicates something very important to someone with avoidant patterns. It tells them that openness doesn't automatically lead to loss of control. That being seen doesn't immediately create expectation. That vulnerability can exist without consequences that feel overwhelming. And that is unfamiliar for them, because most of their internal learning around emotional exposure is built on the idea that openness leads to discomfort, responsibility, or emotional demand. So when they take even a small step toward openness and the experience that follows is calm, grounded, and non-reactive, it starts to challenge that internal belief. It doesn't change everything at once. It doesn't erase years of conditioning, but it creates a new reference point, a different emotional outcome attached to vulnerability. And over time, those small corrections begin to matter more than any single conversation ever could. This is also where patience becomes more than just waiting. It becomes awareness in action. You are not trying to speed up their emotional process. You are not trying to pull consistency out of a moment of softness. You are simply allowing the experience to land without distortion. Because if every moment of openness is met with intensity, the nervous system learns to retreat. And if every moment of openness is met with indifference, the emotional bridge never forms. But when those moments are met with calm attention, something more stable starts to develop underneath the surface. They begin to associate openness with safety instead of risk. And that association is what slowly allows consistency to become possible later on. So the real skill here is restraint, but not emotional suppression. It's restraint in reaction, not restraint in feeling. You are still present, still aware, still engaged, but you are not pushing the moment beyond what it naturally is. And that distinction is what most people miss. They think progress comes from doing more, saying more, proving more. But in these dynamics, progress often comes from doing less, but doing it with more clarity and stability. Because in the end, those brief moments of vulnerability are not asking to be amplified. They are asking to be received. And when they are received properly, without pressure or distortion, they don't disappear as easily. They return. And slowly, they begin to stay a little longer each time. As you start seeing distance not as rejection, but as a psychological pattern, a deeper layer becomes visible. Observation, testing, brief openness, all of it builds toward one revealing point. When you stop leaning in the same way and your energy naturally pulls back, that's when things become clearer. When someone with avoidant tendencies senses your availability changing, not as a tactic, but as a real internal shift, something gets activated. You'll often notice them becoming more present, more responsive, or more engaged in subtle ways. It can feel like a sudden shift, almost a reversal. Psychologically, this happens because avoidant individuals feel safer when connection is controllable and at a distance. But when that control weakens and access to you is no longer guaranteed, the fear of loss becomes real. And loss triggers attachment more than closeness triggers comfort. So your absence disrupts their internal balance. It creates tension they can't ignore. But this reaction doesn't automatically mean readiness or emotional maturity. It only shows that something exists. The key is not to use distance as strategy, but to let it be a result of self-respect and clarity. When your energy retracts naturally, their response becomes information, not something to chase, because ultimately, their reaction shows your value to them, but your standards decide whether that is enough. People often assume love should feel like constant closeness, easy communication, and steady reassurance. And yes, those are healthy expressions of love. But they are not always where the story begins for someone who carries avoidant patterns. For an avoidant person, staying is not simple. It doesn't come naturally or effortlessly. In fact, their default wiring often pulls them toward independence, emotional distance, and self-protection. So when you see them remain connected in any form, despite that internal pull to withdraw, you're not looking at something casual. You're looking at inner conflict in motion, because if there was nothing meaningful there, there would be no conflict at all. That's the part most people miss. When an avoidant truly feels nothing significant, the behavior is clean. They don't linger in the connection. They don't keep reappearing in subtle ways. They don't circle back or maintain any emotional thread. They disengage and they move forward, not because they are cold, but because there is no internal force keeping them attached. But when something does matter, when attachment is forming or already present, you see something very different. You see contradiction. One part of them moves toward closeness, toward familiarity, toward emotional contact. Another part pulls away, toward distance, toward control, toward safety. And instead of resolving that tension cleanly, they live inside it. That's why the connection doesn't fully disappear. It shifts, it pauses, it returns, it goes quiet, and then reappears. There is a rhythm to it, even if it doesn't look stable from the outside. And once you understand that rhythm, you stop seeing it as randomness and start seeing it as internal struggle expressed through behavior. Now, this is where clarity becomes critical, because it's very easy to romanticize persistence. It's easy to interpret "they come back" as the final answer. But return alone is not resolution. Staying in and out of someone's life is not the same as building something stable with them. What their return does indicate is presence of attachment. It shows emotional significance. It shows that complete detachment has not fully taken place. But it does not automatically show readiness, consistency, or emotional capacity to sustain a healthy connection. And that distinction is where emotional maturity lives. Because your role is not to endlessly decode inconsistent behavior or turn uncertainty into meaning just to feel secure. Your role is to see what is actually there, without denying it and without inflating it. You can acknowledge that someone keeps returning and that it means something, while still refusing to abandon your own standards in the process. You don't have to erase your needs just to make someone's limitations easier to fit into your life. You can hold both truths at the same time. That there is attachment, and that attachment alone is not enough. And when you operate from that level of clarity, something shifts inside you. You stop chasing certainty through their behavior. You stop trying to force consistency out of inconsistency. Instead, you start observing patterns over time without emotionally collapsing into each moment. You become less reactive, more grounded, more deliberate in how you respond. Because now you understand something most people overlook. Love does not always present itself in a clean, stable form, especially in someone who fears emotional closeness. Sometimes it appears as hesitation, sometimes as inconsistency, sometimes as a quiet inability to fully detach. But none of that automatically qualifies as alignment. So the question stops being, do they feel something, and becomes something far more important. Is what they are capable of giving actually aligned with what I need to feel emotionally secure, respected, and whole? Because at the end of the day, someone staying in your orbit, even imperfectly, does reveal something. It reveals that you matter enough not to be fully released. But the real turning point in your life is not recognizing that you matter. It's deciding whether being partially held is enough for you, or whether you are done confusing emotional presence with emotional availability. So the real question is no longer whether they notice your absence, but whether their presence is strong enough to ever make you forget it.